The cruelest betrayals never happen in the dark, they happen after someone promises to stay. Ellis Whittaker believed those words only after he opened his eyes to a silence so complete it seemed to swallow the entire world. The fire that had been crackling in the massive stone fireplace only hours earlier had faded into cold grey ash, and the warmth that had briefly eased the ache in his chest was already disappearing. Snow drifted through the narrow gap beneath the heavy front doors, carried by a relentless winter wind that whistled through the empty halls of Blackthorn Manor. Every breath Ellis took scraped painfully against his lungs. His fever had grown worse during the night, leaving his vision blurred and his body too weak to sit upright without trembling. He turned slowly toward the chair beside the fireplace where Tristan Bellamy had promised to keep watch until morning. It was empty. "Tristan!" Ellis called softly, his voice little more than a whisper swallowed by the enormous house. No answer came. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall ticked with unsettling precision, each second sounding louder than the last. Ellis forced himself to stand, steadying one hand against the cold stone mantel while dizziness swept over him. Just yesterday Tristan had insisted that bringing him to the isolated estate was the safest choice. The hospitals in the city were overcrowded, he had explained. Fresh mountain air and a quiet place to recover would help until they could leave for Canada, where specialists supposedly waited to treat Ellis's worsening illness. Ellis had wanted to believe him. After all, Tristan had been beside him through years of doctor visits, prescriptions, and endless promises that everything would eventually get better. But now every room echoed with absence. The kitchen was abandoned. The dining room chairs stood perfectly aligned around a table covered in white sheets. Upstairs, every bedroom remained untouched except the one where Ellis had collapsed after arriving. He reached the front entrance, gripping the polished banister as another wave of coughing bent him forward. Outside, fresh snow completely covered the driveway except for deep tire tracks stretching away from the manor toward the distant forest road. Tristan's SUV was gone. Ellis stared through the frosted glass for several long seconds before lowering his eyes to the leather suitcase resting neatly beside the front door. Relief flickered briefly inside him. Maybe Tristan had left supplies before driving into town. With shaking fingers Ellis unfastened the brass latches and slowly lifted the lid. The suitcase was almost empty. Inside lay a folder of legal papers, a single fountain pen, and one folded envelope bearing his name. Confused, Ellis broke the seal and unfolded the letter. His heartbeat slowed as every line erased another piece of the life he thought he understood. Tristan wrote that he was finished pretending. He claimed years spent caring for a sick Omega had stolen his future, and he refused to sacrifice anything more. Ellis was instructed not to search for him because everything between them was over. Worse still, attached beneath the letter was a property transfer agreement carrying what appeared to be Ellis's own signature, surrendering every asset left to him by his late Uncle Graham Whittaker. Ellis stared at the familiar signature until tears blurred the ink. He had never signed those papers. Someone had copied his handwriting perfectly. His knees weakened, and he sank onto the cold marble floor while the letter slipped from his fingers. Memories of Graham flooded back, the gentle man who had always reminded Ellis that no amount of money mattered more than kindness. Graham had protected him when no one else had. Now even that final gift had apparently been stolen. Another cough seized Ellis, harsher this time, leaving him struggling to breathe. He reached for the medication Tristan had packed the previous evening, only to remember there was none inside the suitcase. Every bottle had disappeared. The realization settled over him with quiet certainty. Tristan had never planned to return. The manor had never been a refuge. It had been a place to leave someone behind where no one would notice if they simply faded away. Ellis closed his eyes, fighting panic as icy air crept through the ancient house. Then, somewhere beyond the towering iron gates at the end of the snow-covered drive, the distant growl of powerful engines broke the silence. One pair of headlights appeared between the trees, followed by another, then a third, their beams cutting through the swirling snowfall like silent warnings. Ellis looked up just as the convoy rolled to a deliberate stop outside the abandoned estate, and for reasons he could not explain, the fear in his chest became something even stranger. It felt as though whoever had arrived already knew exactly where he was. Ellis barely had enough strength to step away from the front door before the first knock echoed through the manor. It was not hurried or aggressive. It was calm, deliberate, almost respectful, yet it carried enough certainty to make the old walls seem to listen. His pulse raced as another wave of dizziness blurred his vision. Every instinct warned him not to open the door, but remaining alone inside the freezing estate suddenly felt even more dangerous. He steadied himself against the wall and slowly turned the heavy brass handle. The icy wind swept through the entrance hall as three men stood outside beneath falling snow. The man in front was tall, dressed in a dark wool overcoat that looked untouched by the storm. His expression remained composed, his sharp grey eyes studying Ellis with quiet focus rather than surprise. Behind him stood two equally disciplined men carrying insulated medical cases instead of weapons. A woman stepped forward from the second vehicle, her navy winter coat marked with the small silver emblem of a private medical practice. Before Ellis could speak, another fit of coughing stole his breath. His knees weakened, and the world tilted beneath him. He expected to hit the cold marble floor, but instead he felt a firm arm catch him with steady precision. The stranger neither rushed nor panicked. He simply supported Ellis carefully until the woman reached them. "Doctor," he said in a calm, measured voice. "His breathing is worse than expected." The woman immediately opened her case and removed a portable oxygen mask. "Ellis, can you hear me?" she asked gently. He nodded weakly as she placed the mask over his nose and mouth. Cool oxygen eased the burning pressure in his chest, allowing him to draw his first comfortable breath in what felt like hours. Confusion quickly replaced panic. "Who are you?" Ellis managed to ask between slow breaths. The man removed a pair of black leather gloves before answering. "My name is Mason Crowe." Ellis recognized the name instantly. Even someone who avoided business news had heard stories about the Crowe Syndicate, a private organization surrounded by rumors of immense influence, careful discipline, and a leader who rarely appeared in public. Nothing about Mason resembled the reckless criminal image painted by gossip. His posture was controlled. His voice never rose. Even the people accompanying him moved with practiced restraint. Dr. Nora Beckett checked Ellis's pulse, listened to his breathing, and handed him medication along with warm water from a thermos. "Your fever is dangerously high," she said. "You should have been treated yesterday." Ellis looked from the medicine to Mason. "How do you know my name?" Mason answered without hesitation. "Because our investigation led us to you months ago." The Crowe Syndicate had grown into one of the country's largest logistics and security organizations, transporting medical equipment and pharmaceutical supplies across several states. Several months ago, one shipment drew my attention after my investigators discovered forged documentation hiding controlled medication among legitimate medical deliveries. Following that trail eventually led us to Tristan Bellamy. At first, my security teams watched only him, hoping to identify everyone connected to the distribution network. But every report they brought back became more troubling than the last. Each one showed your condition steadily worsening while Bellamy continued accepting the same pharmaceutical deliveries. Dr. Beckett reviewed every piece of medical information we could legally obtain and became convinced the treatment you were receiving was making your condition worse instead of better. Even then, we still had no proof that Bellamy understood what those drugs were truly doing, so intervening without evidence would only have placed you in greater danger. This morning, one of my security teams reported Bellamy leaving Blackthorn Manor alone. When they confirmed he never turned back, I decided we could not wait any longer. I brought Dr. Beckett and my medical team because I believed every minute could mean the difference between saving your life and losing it forever. Ellis felt the warmth disappear from his hands despite the blanket one of the men had quietly placed over his shoulders. "Have you been following me?" Mason met his gaze directly. "Watching over you is more accurate." The words only deepened Ellis's uncertainty. "Why?" Mason glanced briefly toward the abandoned driveway before looking back. "Because I knew Tristan Bellamy would eventually leave you here." Ellis stared at him in disbelief. "That is impossible." "No," Mason replied evenly. "It was predictable. Silence settled between them except for the crackling fire one of Mason's men had already rebuilt inside the fireplace. Dr. Beckett finished checking Ellis's temperature before giving Mason a slight nod that seemed to communicate far more than words. Ellis watched every movement with growing suspicion. Everything they needed had arrived within minutes. Extra blankets. Medication. Portable oxygen. Fresh food. Dry firewood. It was as though someone had prepared for this exact moment long before Tristan disappeared. "You expected this," Ellis whispered. Mason did not deny it. "I expected Bellamy to betray you eventually. I hoped I would be wrong." Ellis lowered the oxygen mask slightly. "If you knew, why did you not stop him?" For the first time, Mason's expression shifted, revealing something that resembled regret. "Because until this morning, I believed he would abandon his plan before abandoning you." Ellis struggled to understand any of it. Nothing made sense. Mason walked toward the folded letter still lying on the marble floor beside the open suitcase. He picked it up carefully, then examined the property transfer documents beneath it. His eyes paused on the official seal printed across the bottom page. "Dr. Beckett," he said quietly. "Please stay with Ellis." She looked up immediately. "You found it?" Mason nodded once. "This is the company I was looking for." Ellis frowned. "What company?" Mason turned the document toward him but kept one finger resting over the embossed seal. "The company that certified these papers does not exist on paper anymore. It disappeared 3 years ago." Ellis felt another chill run through him. "Then how can my signature be here?" Mason folded the papers carefully and slipped them back into the folder. "That," he answered while looking toward the snow-covered road beyond the open doorway, "is exactly the question someone has been hoping you would never ask." Ellis remained silent long after Mason finished speaking. The folder containing the forged documents rested on the coffee table between them, yet it seemed to weigh more than the entire manor. Dr. Nora Beckett adjusted the blanket around Ellis's shoulders before checking his temperature once more. "Your fever is beginning to come down," she said softly. "That is a good sign, but you still need to rest." Ellis barely heard her. His attention never left Mason. "You keep saying you know things about my life that you should not know," he finally said. "Either tell me everything or leave me alone." Mason did not answer immediately. He walked toward one of the tall windows overlooking the snow-covered grounds, studying the silent forest beyond the gates before turning back. "Your Uncle Graham Whitaker was not simply a wealthy landowner," he said. "Years ago he managed financial records for several powerful organizations, including mine. He was trusted because he was honest. Eventually he discovered money moving through companies that should not have existed. Someone was hiding illegal transactions behind legitimate businesses." Ellis frowned. "My uncle never spoke about any of that." "He intended to keep you away from it," Mason replied. "Before he died, he disappeared with one ledger containing every transaction, every false company, and every name connected to the operation. After that, several people began searching for him. When they could not find him, they started searching for the only family he had left." Ellis slowly lowered his eyes toward the silver chain resting against his sweater. At the end of it hung a simple oval pendant that Graham had given him on his 18th birthday. "You are looking at my necklace," Ellis whispered. Mason nodded once. "Because that pendant is not simply jewelry." Ellis instinctively wrapped his fingers around it. "My uncle told me never to take it off." "He was right," Mason answered. "Inside that pendant is the only key capable of opening the encrypted records your uncle protected." Ellis stared at him in disbelief. "No. That cannot be true. It has never opened. It does not even have a latch." Mason stepped closer but stopped several feet away, careful not to invade Ellis's space. "Your uncle designed it that way. Only someone who knew what to look for would recognize it." Ellis felt his heartbeat quicken. "So that is why Tristan stayed with me all these years." Mason's expression remained steady. "I believe Tristan wanted your inheritance at first. Later, someone else discovered what your uncle had hidden and convinced him there was something far more valuable than money. Ellis looked away, struggling to process the possibility that nearly every important relationship in his adult life had been built on deception. "Then why have you been watching me?" he asked quietly. "If you knew all this, why did you never tell me?" Mason answered with complete honesty. "Because every time I considered approaching you, Bellamy was still beside you. I believed confronting him without proof would only place you in greater danger." Ellis let out a slow breath. "So you simply watched?" "Yes." "For how long?" "6 months." The answer stung more than Ellis expected. "6 months," he repeated. "You knew I was sick. You knew someone might betray me. You knew I carried something I never understood, and you still stayed in the shadows." Mason accepted the accusation without defending himself. "I made the decision I believed would keep you alive. Looking at you now, I am not certain it was the right one." The room fell silent again until Dr. Beckett gently removed the pendant from beneath Ellis's collar to check the irritation caused by the chain rubbing against his feverish skin. As she turned the silver piece beneath the light, Mason's eyes narrowed. A nearly invisible symbol engraved along the back edge reflected against the firelight. His expression changed instantly. "Doctor," he said quietly. "Turn it over." She did. The tiny emblem matched a design Mason seemed to recognize immediately. Before anyone could speak again, the sharp crack of breaking glass echoed through the manor. Cold winter air rushed inside as fragments scattered across the wooden floor. Everyone froze. Ellis instinctively looked toward the shattered window where snow now drifted into the room. Embedded deep within the large framed portrait of Graham Whittaker hanging on the opposite wall was a single metal object that had pierced the canvas without striking anyone. The impact had torn away part of the old painting, exposing something hidden beneath it. Mason stepped forward carefully and pulled aside the loose fabric. Behind the portrait, concealed within the wooden frame itself, rested the corner of an aged parchment marked with faded red lines. Ellis stared in astonishment as Mason unfolded the concealed map just enough to reveal a single crimson mark positioned directly beneath the manor's private chapel, and somewhere beyond the silent hallway, the unmistakable sound of slow approaching footsteps echoed through the house. The footsteps stopped just beyond the hallway, leaving the entire manor wrapped in a silence that felt heavier than the winter storm outside. Ellis held his breath as Mason quietly folded the hidden map and slipped it inside his coat. Dr. Nora Beckett instinctively moved closer to Ellis while the two men who had accompanied Mason exchanged brief glances before taking positions near the entrance without a single unnecessary word. Whoever had approached the manor no longer seemed interested in making noise. That realization unsettled Ellis even more than the sound itself. Mason studied the dark corridor for several seconds before speaking in a calm voice. "We are leaving this room." Ellis looked at the map still partially visible beneath Mason's coat. "What about whatever is hidden under the chapel?" Mason answered without hesitation. "It has remained there for years. It can remain there another hour." Ellis slowly shook his head. "No. If someone else knows about the map, they are not here because of me. They are here because of that." Mason met his eyes. For the first time since arriving, he hesitated. Ellis could see him weighing risk against opportunity. Finally Mason nodded once. "Then tell me what you know about this house." Ellis looked toward the portrait of his late uncle. "When I was little, Uncle Graham used to bring me here every Christmas. He always said the manor was older than the town itself. He showed me hidden doors because he thought secret passages made old houses feel magical instead of lonely." His breathing grew uneven, but he continued. "There is another way to the chapel. The main staircase is only for visitors. The servants used a narrow passage behind the library." Mason turned immediately toward one of his men. "Check the library entrance." Barely a minute later the man returned with a surprised expression and a small brass key found behind an old bookshelf. Ellis recognized it instantly. "That opens the service corridor." Mason gave a quiet nod of approval. "You remember more than you realize." They moved quickly through the dim hallway illuminated only by portable lanterns. Dust covered every surface, and the scent of aged wood filled the narrow passage hidden behind the walls. Ellis leaned against the stone whenever another coughing spell interrupted his steps, but he refused every offer to be carried. "I can still walk," he insisted. "If I stop now, I may never understand why my uncle protected this place." Mason accepted the answer without argument, matching Ellis's slower pace instead of forcing him forward. After several minutes, the hidden corridor opened behind the small private chapel. Moonlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting blue and crimson reflections across the worn stone floor. Ellis knelt beside the old wooden altar and closed his eyes, searching distant childhood memories. Then he noticed something almost invisible beneath years of dust. One floor tile carried the same tiny symbol engraved on the back of his silver pendant. "Here," Ellis whispered. Mason carefully moved the altar aside while Ellis pressed against the marked stone. Nothing happened. He looked down at the pendant resting in his hand. "My uncle always told me never to lose this," he murmured. "Maybe it was never meant to be worn. Maybe it was meant to fit somewhere." Together they examined the stone until Ellis found a narrow opening no wider than the edge of the pendant. His hands trembled as he gently slid the silver piece into place. A quiet mechanical click echoed beneath the floor. The stone shifted just enough to reveal a concealed iron ring. Mason lifted the heavy slab with help from one of his men, exposing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Cool air drifted upward, carrying the faint scent of earth untouched for decades. Ellis stared into the hidden passage with equal parts fear and determination. Before anyone could take the first step, the manor itself seemed to tremble as a distant crash echoed from somewhere above them. Dust drifted from the chapel ceiling. Mason immediately stepped between Ellis and the staircase, his expression sharpening. "Someone else has entered the house," he said quietly. Ellis tightened his grip on the pendant and looked into the darkness below. "Then we cannot turn back now. If we leave whatever my uncle hid down there, they will eventually find it." Mason searched Ellis's exhausted face for a long moment before giving a slow nod. "Then we move together, and no one makes another decision alone." The narrow staircase descended far deeper than Ellis remembered, each worn stone step carrying them farther beneath Blackthorn Manor and farther away from the world he thought he understood. Mason switched on a compact lantern, its warm beam revealing walls reinforced with old brick and heavy timber that had somehow survived decades without anyone discovering them. The air grew cooler with every step, carrying the scent of damp earth and forgotten history. Dr. Nora Beckett stayed close behind Ellis, quietly reminding him to slow his breathing whenever another cough interrupted his pace. After nearly 2 minutes of careful descent, the staircase ended before a massive steel door coated with dust. At its center rested a circular indentation identical to the shape of Ellis's silver pendant. Ellis exchanged a glance with Mason before removing the pendant from its chain once again. His fingers trembled as he placed it into the opening. A series of soft mechanical clicks echoed through the chamber, followed by the slow release of old locking bolts that had remained sealed for years. The heavy door opened just enough for cool air to escape from the hidden room beyond. Lantern light revealed shelves lined with weathered ledgers, locked document boxes, and neatly labeled storage cases that appeared untouched since Graham Whittaker had hidden them away. Ellis stepped inside carefully, overwhelmed by the realization that his uncle had built an entire secret archive beneath the family estate. Mason remained near the entrance, allowing Ellis to explore first. "This belongs to your family," he said quietly. "You should be the first to see it." Ellis approached an old oak desk where a single envelope rested beneath a layer of dust. His name had been written across the front in Graham's unmistakable handwriting. With unsteady hands he opened it. Inside was a brief letter. Graham apologized for keeping so many secrets and explained that if Ellis was reading those words, it meant people had finally found what they had been searching for. He urged Ellis never to trust anyone completely, including those who claimed to be allies, because greed often disguised itself as kindness. Ellis struggled to steady his breathing as he folded the letter against his chest. Nearby, Mason carefully examined one of the locked cabinets. Inside were accounting records exactly as he had described, but another shelf immediately caught Dr. Beckett's attention. Dozens of medical files had been organized alphabetically. She pulled one free and frowned. "Ellis," she said softly. "I think you need to see this." Ellis accepted the folder and froze the moment he read his own name printed across the cover. Inside were laboratory reports dating back almost 8 years, documenting medications he had taken, physical examinations he had never remembered receiving, and repeated notes describing gradual respiratory decline. Dr. Beckett carefully compared the reports with the prescription bottles Ellis had carried during previous treatments. Her expression grew increasingly troubled. "These records do not match," she said. "The medication listed here is completely different from the medication you were actually given." Ellis stared at her in confusion. "What does that mean?" Nora hesitated only briefly before answering honestly. "It means someone replaced your treatment years ago. The medicine you trusted was not helping your condition. It was slowly making it worse." The room fell silent. Ellis felt as though the ground beneath him had disappeared. Every doctor visit, every worsening symptom, every promise that his illness was simply progressing suddenly took on an entirely different meaning. Mason quietly opened another folder and discovered invoices connecting the altered prescriptions to a pharmaceutical distributor that had once supplied several businesses connected to the Crowe syndicate. He closed the file without hiding it. "My family's organization transported shipments from this company years ago," he admitted. "We believed they were legitimate medical supplies. We were wrong." Ellis slowly lifted his eyes. Hurt replaced confusion. "So your organization helped destroy my health?" Mason did not step away from the accusation. "Whether we knew it or not, we became part of what happened to you. That responsibility belongs to me now." Before Ellis could respond, a secure satellite phone inside Mason's coat vibrated. The screen displayed an incoming video call from Tristan Bellamy. Mason accepted it without speaking. Tristan appeared calm, standing somewhere outside in the snow. Beside him stood Dr. Nora's assistant, restrained but unharmed, clearly frightened. Tristan smiled faintly before speaking. "I knew you would find the hidden room eventually. If you want your friend back safely, bring Ellis and everything Graham left behind before sunrise. Do not keep me waiting." The screen went dark, leaving only the quiet hum of the underground chamber and the unbearable realization that the betrayal surrounding Ellis had always been much larger than one abandoned manor. The underground chamber remained silent long after Tristan's face disappeared from the phone screen. Ellis lowered himself into the old wooden chair beside his uncle's desk, his hand still gripping the medical file that had rewritten everything he believed about his illness. Every memory now felt uncertain. Every prescription bottle Tristan had handed him, every reassuring smile, every promise that recovery simply required more patience suddenly carried a different meaning. Dr. Nora Beckett gently closed the folder and looked toward Mason. "We do not have much time." Mason nodded but did not immediately respond. Instead, he carefully placed Graham's ledgers into a reinforced case before turning toward Ellis. "We leave through the secondary passage. I will send my people to recover Nora's assistant while we move you somewhere safe." Ellis slowly shook his head. "No." Mason frowned slightly. "This is not a negotiation." Ellis stood despite the weakness still lingering in his legs. "That is exactly what Tristan always believed. He decided where I lived, which doctor I saw, what medicine I swallowed, and what future I deserved. I am finished letting other people make every decision for me." Mason remained silent, allowing Ellis to continue. "Tristan does not want the ledgers," Ellis said. "He wants me because he thinks I will eventually open whatever my uncle hid. If I disappear now, he will keep chasing everyone around me." Dr. Beckett looked concerned. "Ellis, you are still recovering. You should not place yourself in more danger." Ellis met her eyes with quiet determination. "I already am in danger. Running away only changes the address." Mason studied Ellis for several long seconds. "What are you proposing?" Ellis walked toward the steel shelves and picked up one of the identical leather document cases. "We give Tristan exactly what he expects." He opened the case and filled it with several ordinary accounting books that carried no sensitive information before placing a folded map on top. He has never seen the real ledger. He only knows it exists. He will believe this is what he came for. Mason crossed his arms thoughtfully. And while he examines the false documents, you find whoever has been controlling him. Mason remained unconvinced. That plan depends on Tristan making a mistake. Ellis nodded. He already has. He called you instead of me. That means someone else is giving him instructions and wants to know whether you found the archive. Dr. Beckett looked at Mason. He has a point. Mason slowly exhaled before looking back at Ellis. Even if the plan works, I cannot ask you to walk into that meeting. Ellis smiled sadly. You are not asking. I am choosing. Those words seemed to settle something inside Mason. For the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Manor, he stopped giving orders. Instead, he asked a single question. What do you need from me? Ellis answered without hesitation. Trust me for 10 minutes. Mason gave a slow nod. You have it. Together they quickly prepared the exchange. Mason quietly slipped a miniature tracking device beneath the false ledger while Dr. Beckett adjusted Ellis's oxygen supply and replaced the medication in his coat pocket. Ellis carefully fastened his silver pendant around his neck again before closing the empty document case. As they climbed back toward the chapel, the distant sounds from above had disappeared. The manor felt strangely still, as if it too were waiting for sunrise. Reaching the entrance hall once more, Ellis paused beneath the enormous staircase where Tristan had abandoned him only hours earlier. Snow continued falling beyond the open front doors, covering the old tire tracks with a fresh white blanket. In the distance, a single vehicle appeared at the end of the driveway exactly where Tristan had demanded they meet. Ellis tightened his grip on the leather case before taking one slow breath. Mason stepped beside him but did not move ahead. This time he allowed Ellis to choose the first step. Ellis walked forward alone into the pale winter morning carrying the false ledger, knowing that for the first time since his illness began, every decision he made truly belonged to him. While hidden beneath the leather binding, the tiny tracking device silently began transmitting its signal toward the person who believed the deception had finally succeeded. The tracking signal led them away from Blackthorn Manor and across nearly 40 miles of winding mountain roads before stopping at the edge of an abandoned medical complex hidden behind rows of leafless oak trees. The weathered sign above the entrance still read St. Orizon Medical Center, although years of snow, rain, and neglect had nearly erased the lettering. Ellis stared through the windshield in silence. Something about the building felt strangely familiar even though he had never consciously remembered visiting it. Mason shut off the engine and studied the signal on his tablet. The transmitter has not moved for 12 minutes, he said quietly. Bellamy is still inside. Dr. Nora Beckett frowned as she looked at the faded structure. This hospital officially closed almost a decade ago. Ellis slowly shook his head. Then why would someone protect it? Mason answered before anyone else could. Because abandoned buildings are perfect places to hide records that were never supposed to exist. They entered carefully through a side corridor where broken ceiling panels allowed pale winter light to spill across dusty tile floors. Instead of finding empty rooms, they discovered filing cabinets arranged in perfect rows, electrical generators still operating somewhere beneath the building, and shelves filled with sealed document boxes. Someone had maintained the facility all these years. Ellis felt his chest tighten for reasons that had nothing to do with his illness. Dr. Beckett opened the nearest cabinet and quietly pulled out a patient file. Her expression changed immediately. Ellis, she whispered. You need to see this. The folder belonged to another Omega barely older than Ellis. The medical notes described unexplained respiratory decline, repeated medication adjustments, and eventual legal transfer of family assets after the patient had been declared medically incapable of managing personal affairs. Ellis reached for another folder. Then another. Every file followed the same pattern. Different names. Different families. Nearly identical outcomes. This was never about me, Ellis said softly. I was only one of many. Mason opened another storage cabinet containing financial records instead of medical files. Every transfer eventually passed through shell companies connected to the same hidden network Graham Whittaker had been investigating before his death. One signature appeared again and again at the bottom of authorization forms. Victor Sloan. Ellis recognized the name immediately from his uncle's old conversations. Victor had once been introduced as a respected financial advisor trusted by wealthy families throughout the region. "He was standing beside us all along," Ellis whispered. "No one ever questioned him." Mason slowly nodded. "He advised my father for years as well. We believed he was protecting legitimate investments. Instead, he was building an empire behind everyone else's trust." Ellis looked around the endless rows of forgotten files. All these people lost their futures because someone convinced the world they were too sick to protect themselves. Dr. Beckett quietly gathered several boxes of evidence. If these records become public, dozens of families could finally recover what was stolen. Mason remained silent for a long moment before speaking. "If we release everything, my family's organization will also be investigated. Our shipping companies unknowingly transported supplies connected to this operation. Even without criminal intent, we will face enormous consequences." Ellis turned toward him. "Then tell me honestly. What matters more to you? Protecting your reputation or protecting everyone whose lives were destroyed?" Mason held Ellis's gaze without looking away. The question lingered between them as heavily as the years of deception surrounding the hospital. Finally, Mason reached for his secure satellite phone. He contacted every senior member of his organization with a single instruction: transfer every recovered document to federal investigators and every verified news agency immediately. Hold nothing back. One of his lieutenants hesitated over the connection. "Sir, this could dismantle everything your father built." Mason answered calmly. "Then we will build something better." Ellis looked at him with quiet surprise. For the first time since they met, he saw not the feared leader described in whispered rumors, but a man willingly sacrificing power because the truth mattered more than protecting his own legacy. Before anyone could say another word, slow applause echoed through the deserted hallway. Tristan Bellamy stepped from the shadows wearing a composed smile that never reached his eyes. Behind him, an older man in an immaculate charcoal coat emerged with measured confidence. Mason's expression hardened immediately. "Victor Sloan," he said. The older man inclined his head politely. "It has been a long time, Mason. Thank you for bringing exactly what I needed." Victor Sloan's smile never faltered as he slowly looked from Mason to Ellis, as though he had been expecting every step they had taken since leaving Blackthorn Manor. "You have always been predictable," Victor said in an almost conversational tone. "One of you believes in justice. The other believes everyone deserves another chance. Those qualities make admirable people, but they also make very convenient opponents." Tristan stood a few feet behind him, avoiding Ellis's eyes for the first time since they had entered the abandoned hospital. The confidence he had displayed only moments earlier seemed weaker now, replaced by uncertainty. Ellis noticed it immediately. "You lied to him too," Ellis said quietly. Victor gave a soft laugh. "Everyone hears exactly what they wish to hear. Tristan wanted wealth. Mason wanted redemption. You wanted honesty. I simply allowed each of you to chase your favorite illusion." Mason remained calm. "It is over, Victor. Every document has already been transmitted." Victor reached into his coat and produced a small remote device. "Not quite." Without pressing any dramatic button, he simply held up the screen, revealing that emergency containment systems throughout the abandoned hospital had been activated remotely years before. Heavy security doors began sliding into place throughout the building while ventilation alarms echoed through empty corridors. Emergency lights washed the hallways in a steady crimson glow. Dr. Nora Beckett quickly checked the building map displayed beside the nearest doorway. "The ventilation system has sealed multiple sections," she said. "If we stay here too long, oxygen levels in several corridors will gradually drop below safe limits." Mason immediately removed the portable oxygen cylinder from Ellis's shoulder bag and placed it into Ellis's hands. "You keep this." Ellis looked up in surprise. What about you? You need it more than I do. Ellis shook his head. We will both need it if we are getting out. Victor calmly stepped backward toward another hallway. I only need a few more minutes. Once my files disappear with this building, history becomes whatever survives. Before anyone could follow him, Tristan suddenly looked from Victor to Ellis, then back again. His expression changed as realization finally replaced ambition. You never intended to share anything with me, he whispered. Victor did not deny it. You were useful. That is all. Tristan lowered his head, visibly understanding that every promise made to him had been another carefully designed manipulation. He slowly stepped aside instead of blocking the hallway any longer. Ellis watched him with quiet sadness rather than anger. You always blamed my illness, Ellis said. But the truth is that you built your future on someone else's suffering because it seemed easier than building one of your own. Tristan closed his eyes, unable to answer. Mason glanced toward Ellis. The control room is behind that corridor. If we restore ventilation, investigators will have enough time to secure every record. Ellis remembered the maintenance diagrams hidden inside Graham's archive. The old emergency override is not in the control room, he said. It is inside the mechanical archive beneath radiology. The builders wanted a manual backup in case the electrical system failed. Victor's confident expression disappeared for the first time. He had not expected Ellis to know the original design. Guided by Ellis's memory, the group quickly reached the hidden access panel where a large mechanical release wheel remained exactly where Graham had documented decades earlier. Mason waited for Ellis instead of acting first. Your choice, he said simply. Ellis nodded and turned the heavy wheel until the locking mechanism released with a deep metallic sound. Fresh air gradually returned through the ventilation system as emergency doors unlocked throughout the building. Outside, the distant sound of approaching sirens grew louder with every passing second. Victor looked toward the windows and quietly lowered his shoulders, recognizing that every route he had carefully planned had disappeared. Within minutes, federal investigators and local authorities entered the hospital, taking custody of every recovered record along with everyone connected to the operation. As officers escorted Victor and Tristan away, Mason turned toward Ellis, whose breathing had once again become uneven after the exhausting morning. Mason gently steadied him without saying a word. Ellis looked up, meeting the Alpha's calm grey eyes. Mason spoke softly enough that only Ellis could hear. I chose to protect you before you even knew my name. But from this moment forward, I will never decide your future for you. If I remain in your life, it will only be because you choose it too. Ellis did not answer immediately. Instead, despite the fatigue pulling at every muscle, he reached forward and quietly took Mason's hand of his own free will. 3 months later, the first signs of spring had replaced the snow that once buried Blackthorn Manor beneath silence. Warm sunlight spilled through windows that had remained dark for years, filling every room with light instead of loneliness. The old estate no longer felt abandoned. Carpenters repaired broken floors, gardeners restored the neglected grounds, and medical volunteers moved carefully through newly renovated rooms that had been transformed into a recovery center for Omegas and families who had suffered financial exploitation or medical fraud. Ellis Whitaker stood on the second-floor balcony overlooking the gardens with a warm cup of tea resting between his hands. His breathing was steadier now, although a small inhaler still remained in his coat pocket as a reminder that true healing required patience rather than miracles. Dr. Nora Beckett had carefully redesigned his treatment after exposing the years of falsified medication. Week by week, his lungs had slowly grown stronger. The progress was real, but it had come through honest medical care, determination, and time instead of false promises. The investigation surrounding St. Orazan Medical Center had spread across the country. Families who had once believed their loved ones had simply become too ill to manage their own lives finally learned the truth. Financial records recovered from Graham Whitaker's hidden archive restored stolen inheritances, while dozens of fraudulent companies connected to Victor Sloan quietly disappeared under federal supervision. Victor himself was convicted through documented evidence and witness testimony rather than rumor, bringing an end to a network that had operated unseen for years. Tristan Bellamy accepted responsibility for his role in the deception and received a prison sentence reflecting the evidence presented against him. Several weeks before the trial concluded, Ellis had visited him one final time. There had been no anger left in the conversation, only honesty. Tristan apologized for every choice he had made, admitting that he had slowly convinced himself ambition mattered more than compassion. Ellis listened quietly before answering with words that surprised even himself. Forgiveness does not erase consequences, and kindness does not require forgetting. I hope you become someone who never repeats these choices again. Then he walked away without looking back, leaving the past exactly where it belonged. Mason Crowe faced consequences as well. Although investigators confirmed he had not participated knowingly in Victor's operation, companies connected to his organization had transported supplies later used within the fraudulent medical network. Rather than defend his reputation, Mason voluntarily opened every financial record under his authority and dissolved every remaining business that could not meet strict legal and ethical standards. The decision cost him influence, wealth, and years of work, but it also allowed something entirely different to emerge. The legitimate companies that remained were reorganized into charitable foundations supporting victims of financial abuse, medical recovery, and educational scholarships. When reporters asked why he had surrendered so much without resistance, Mason answered with only one sentence. Power has no value if protecting it costs someone else's future. Despite everything they had shared, Mason rarely visited Blackthorn Manor during those months. He believed Ellis deserved the freedom to rebuild a life that belonged entirely to him without feeling obligated to the man who had once rescued him. So when the grand reopening of the manor finally arrived, Mason remained outside the front gate, quietly watching guests arrive beneath rows of newly planted maple trees. He had no intention of entering unless invited. Ellis noticed him almost immediately through the tall entrance windows. Without hesitation, he walked across the restored stone pathway carrying the same black wool overcoat Mason had wrapped around him on the night they first met. Reaching the gate, Ellis smiled gently before holding out the folded coat. Mason accepted it with quiet gratitude. I only wanted to make sure you were doing well, he said. That is enough for me. Ellis shook his head. No. It was enough for the frightened version of me who believed surviving was the same as living. He stepped closer and carefully placed the coat across Mason's shoulders before looking directly into his eyes. You chose to protect me when I had almost nothing left. You respected my choices even when they frightened you. Now my life belongs to me again, and because it does, I finally get to choose the future I want. Mason remained silent, allowing Ellis to finish. Ellis reached for Mason's hand with complete certainty. I choose you. A year later, Blackthorn Manor had become a place where every window remained filled with light long after sunset. Families found hope there instead of fear, and every room carried reminders that recovery was possible even after years of betrayal. On a quiet spring evening, Mason stood with Ellis inside the entrance hall where the cold fireplace had once marked the loneliest night of Ellis's life. This time the fire burned warmly beside them. There were no contracts waiting on the table, no hidden conditions, and no impossible bargains. Only two people who had rebuilt themselves one difficult step at a time. As laughter drifted through the restored manor behind them, Ellis looked toward the glowing windows and realized that the house where he had once been abandoned had become the very place where he finally found home. What would you have done if you were in this situation? Tell us in the comments. If you love Alpha and Omega stories filled with passion, loyalty, heartbreak, and second chances, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story.